Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's panel session, Exponentials 2.0. What's changing, how fast, and what does it mean? I think you're up for a pretty exciting session with some lively debates, we hope, and the panel's been convened by Peter Armstrong. Peter's the General Manager of Mitton's Electronet. So, look, without further ado, I will invite Peter and the panellists to the stage. Peter.
Good afternoon, everybody. There should be a presentation making its way up there shortly. So, well done for getting to the Friday afternoon. We're not too far away from the finish. I'm wearing a T-shirt today at an EEA conference. We're close to the weekend. We've had a lot of amazing talks, and this afternoon we get one last chance to hear from some of the experts that we've really enjoyed listening to this week. So. Today we're going to follow a similar, for those of you who were at the EEA conference last year, we're going to follow a sort of similar format to the one that we did in the closing session last year. I'm going to give a talk for about 15 minutes or so. A little bit off topic from some of the things that we've been discussing, but really around this theme of the fact that we're being influenced increasingly by accelerating change. So the stories that I tell today, and I think this will lead into some really interesting discussion with the panellists, is all about, things are changing so fast, it's very difficult to be firm about our strategies and how do we do that. So that's the plan. I'm really keen to have some interactivity from you guys today. So I'll probably will call on you, not necessarily just at the end, but during the day. And yeah, that's the plan. So I'm going to kick off by telling a few stories. Before I do, I'll reintroduce our amazing panel. So from left to right, from left to right for you guys, starting with Shay Ramarad. So Shay's is an amazing person. We heard from Shay on Wednesday. She has 4 patents, microgrid renewable integration. And was recently recognised in Chicago as one of the top 40 up-and-coming people under the age of 40, an absolutely amazing achievement. She's originally from Iran, has lived in 7 countries, speaks 5 languages, truly a global citizen. So amazing, and she tells me centre in ice hockey, so very good at hitting things and potentially people as well, so bear that in mind. So moving on, we have Rob Stevens. So Rob, he would like you to think that he's here representing Seagray. In particular, he has a role in study committee B2, but actually the truth is he's a bass player for the band B2 or not 2B, and when the study committee gets together, they basically play music, and I think they do some talking about overhead lines as well. So he's on tour. He's been in Paris, Dublin, Madrid, and now of course Auckland. So welcome to Rob. We have Steve J, who many of us know very well. He's standing in for Alison Andrew. Steve's story is that he got left standing by Alison. She buggered off and left him to do the job. But we know Steve very well. He is board member of the EEA, a very well recognised leader in the power industry here in New Zealand. When he's not playing music, sailing and Cook Strait, climbing New Zealand's challenging peaks, he's playing a critical role really in steering Transpower. So thanks very much, Steve, for stepping in on behalf of Alison. And down the end, we have Olivia Carpenter. So Olivia opening keynote on Wednesday, fantastic speech. So we know from that Olivia is a ninja when it comes to innovation, but I've learned throughout the course of the week that she's actually a ninja in real life as well. Got a black belt in Taekwondo, 4th Dan. Welcome the panel. So before we get back to the panel, I want to just take a little bit of time to talk to you guys about this topic, this exciting sounding topic, Exponentials 2.0, what's changing, how fast, and other questions. So we will go off-piste a little as we did last year. It just as out of interest before I carry on, how many people were here this time last year? Okay, about half. Okay, so there's a little bit of repetition at the beginning for those who sort of heard some of these stories last year, but then we move on to some new ideas. So just before we do, really quickly, most of you will have heard of us, Mitton Electronet. We're in the power industry here in New Zealand, and look, I just wanted to only say one thing really. Congratulations to our winners, to Rebecca for Young Engineer of the Year award this year, really cool achievement. So this time last year, we introduced this idea of the power performance of computing, and it came from the fact that Gordon Moore noticed in 1967 that the number of transistors that it could be fitted on a microchip was approximately doubling every 2 years. So this theme has continued. We looked at this and thought that's really interesting. And then we took it forward and said, well, actually, if you go back beyond 1967 into the past, you can look at a slightly different but similar metric, which is the price performance of computing. So that is the number of calculations per second per $1,000. And when you do that, you actually see that this exponential trend has been going on for a very long time, right back the early electromechanical devices, relays, vacuum tubes, transistors, and through to ICs today. So that's been going for a very long time, and it really has an interesting effect on a number of technologies and industries, as you'll see. And that's sort of one of the core underlying themes about the talk today and the subsequent panel discussion. We also spent some time last year talking about disruption. And I won't retell the story, well, I'll do it in sort of 20 seconds or less, but we talked about the spice trade, ancient trade, 2,500 years of shipping spices around the world, and what disrupted that. It was actually refrigeration. The spice trade, if you like, thought it was in the business of selling spices, but actually it was food preservation, and refrigeration seriously disrupted that. And that led us to think as an industry, well, what industry are we really in? And where's this disruption going to come from? So that was good fun. That was last year. We heard at the time some things like from Transpower that they were the heavy trucking part of the industry for energy, shifting it around, and heard from the keynotes. So I'm going to kick off with a story from the news recently and from a completely different industry. It does have its heart in exponentials, as you'll see near the end, but some of you will have seen this. About 4 weeks ago, breathtaking headline. It was picked up by media all around the world, but a woman, Judy Perkins from, I think, Florida in the US, environmental engineer, she found out at the age of 47 that she had terminal breast cancer. So metastatic cancer, 3 months to live. So she was obviously pretty devastated, went through chemotherapy, the usual trials, and got to the point where she said, well, okay, just got ready for the end. And during that phase, she went and saw a talk from an immunologist who was describing a type of experimental immunotherapy that was going on, and so she cornered the speaker at the end and over a beer, apparently, and got herself on this trial. And so, as you can see from the headline, the result is really quite breathtaking. It gets eradicated. So what they did is they took, the doctors took biopsies from the primary tumour, and they extracted immune cells from the tumour itself. And then, critically, they performed routine genome sequencing of the tumour and understood the precise mutations that characterised it. They were then able to go away and develop cultures of the specific antigens that targeted the mutations in her particular cancer, grow them in the lab, 80 billion or something of them, reintroduce them into her body, and then that launched an immune response against the cancer. So fantastic bit of science. Immunotherapy, for those who have some experience, has been around for a very, very long time. It was pioneered around before the 1900s. But really interesting, and like you can actually see here some of the imagery that Judy made available as a result of the trial. You can see the tumour on the, was it for you guys, the left-hand side. And you can actually see really clearly, I think that's an inferior view showing her liver on the lower part. But then 14 months later, of course, the cancer's completely dissolved. Here's a quote. She said that she was obviously in a lot of discomfort near the end, but she, very soon after the treatment started, noticed the tumours were sort of dissolving and falling away. And one of the leading cancer researchers in America describes this as us as being on the cusp of a major revolution, finally realising the elusive goal of being able to target the plethora of mutations. So that's super exciting. And along with a lot of other reasons, that's one example of why I'm extremely optimistic about the rate of change that we're experiencing at the moment. So what's the link? This is the result of a new emerging field called precision medicine that focuses very much on targeting individual genes. I talked a little bit about this last time, and I'm not going to go too much further other than to point to this chart, which again we discussed briefly. This describes the price performance. So think about that price performance of computing graph that we saw about 3 or 4 minutes ago the price performance of sequencing a human genome. It took 10 years between about 1987 and 2000, 13 years or so, to sequence the human genome, cost $3 billion. Look what's happened to the price since. It's now a routine process, and the reason for this is because of the effect of computing. Computing has become, well, there are other reasons, of course, but one of the primary drivers is the ability to do sequence 3 billion base pairs quickly and routinely. So the thing with exponential change or exponential technologies is it's very deceptive. The next couple of stories and figures that we talk about really sort of play to that deception and the difficulty of predicting change. The great example that I've heard and I've used many times, and I said last year as well, was that if we're going to take 30 steps, as humans we can pretty easily understand what 30 steps means. It's going to be 30 metres or so. If we take 30 exponential steps, of course, 2 to the 30, it's into the billions. Very difficult to get your head around that. You're only halfway there at the 29th step too. So very confusing, very hard to predict, right? So let's look at some stories that kind of address, well, I guess not, I don't necessarily answer how you set strategy, but they address the consequences of not properly setting strategy. I just love this photo so much. I'll try and put it up whenever I can. This is Steve Sasson. Steve Sasson was hired by, so who's heard the Kodak story? I reckon 1 or 2 people have heard the Kodak story. I'm going to tell the Kodak story. But Steve Sasson, I'll tell it my own way. You might learn something, you might not. You might be able to tell us something when we do the Q&A. But Steve Sasson was hired by Kodak in 1973 to research charge coupled devices, CCDs, which of course are prevalent these days. And he went away and took about 4 or 5 years, and he came back and he showed the senior management of Kodak this thing. This is a digital camera. And for those who were born in 1990 or later, that thing right by his ear it's called a cassette tape. It's like an MP3 except terrible. The way this thing works, it's a 0.01 megapixel camera, so it's 100 by 100 pixels. It takes the photo in 50 milliseconds, so that's okay. It's sort of fast. But then spends 23 seconds writing it onto the tape. He took it, showed the management, and they said, "What are you talking about? This is crazy. It's hopeless. No one's going to want to use this." And he said, "Oh, come on. When we can actually show the photos on TV, no one's going to ever want to see their photos on television. But look, you're making progress with CCD, so away you go. Go back and do some work." So he comes back. So that was about 4 years. He comes back. I think it's about 14 months later or something like that, and he's got a 0.02. Megapixel camera, and it's a little bit faster, and he shows them like, no. But so they let him continue. 0.04 takes about 6 months. So already we can see the beginnings of doubling of performance. And so I think we know how the story ends. I've got a slide which shows the patent, part of the patent, I should say. Kodak went on, of course, they owned the patent. They went on to make billions out of licensing the technology. Of course, went bankrupt in 2012. In '89, Sasson had actually invented a DSLR camera, and the marketing department at the time just said, "No, we can't do that." Kodak owned like a large quantum of the world's silver supply chain. They had labs, they had photos, they had cameras, they had everything. It was just a massive threat. So they said, no way. And of course, we know what happened, right? So pretty interesting. Steve Sasson himself, he's okay though. He got I think a few years ago, awarded the President's Medal for Innovation. He's doing fine. But Kodak, we know what happened to them. So, okay, what about our industry? So the title of this talk is about what's changing, how fast. So I think let's have a bit of a look, some stories that sort of paint some pictures about what we think is happening here. I'm going to start with just looking at the IEA, and this is, I don't know if anyone here is here from the IEA, it's definitely not a beat up of the IEA. This is a discussion about how it's very difficult to predict the future. So the IEA releases this report, many of you will have read it. It's called the World Energy Outlook. It comes out on a very regular basis. They call themselves the gold standard, and I think a reasonably trusted organisation. They have a reputation for various things, but I think IEA was founded in the 70s, been around for quite some time. And there they are recently making a pretty incredible statement about solar costs. So how do the IEA go with predicting the uptake of solar? I came across this study recently by a sort of intergovernmental group of scientists and politicians, I should add. And they looked at the IEA's performance when it came to predicting the uptake of solar. Actually, before I get to that, here's Here's a recent executive summary from the WEO report, saying pretty rational things, large-scale shifts in technology, bit of a focus on China's economy. We're going to talk a little bit about China in a minute as well. So yeah, pretty good, pretty well trusted. So how have they performed? Let's give them a little assessment on how they've gone at predicting the future. Now this graph comes from Energy Watch Group. They've taken the WEO studies and looked at the EIEA's forward predictions of solar uptake since 2002. And if you start at the bottom curve, the blue one, that's what they said in 2002. Then in 2004, that's what they said, and then work your way up. And then the dark blue line is what actually happened in terms of solar uptake. So extremely difficult to predict that there was going to be such a strong exponential uptake. I've got a few other slides that talk about this uptake. And if you were in the earlier session, you will have heard me ask the question where I mentioned that there's been like a 400 times increase in solar over the last 15 or so years. So this is where that data comes from. This is Ramez Naam, a really awesome future of energy communicator. This is some of his data, and just showing again that really exponential growth of solar, 1992 to 2017. We've seen a huge increase. And here's some more data. I think just showing the breakdown of where the growth is happening. I sort of, despite the Transpowers report looking a little bit at macroeconomics and thinking about the rise of populism and changes in macroeconomic power, I think it's interesting to just look at where the development's happening and why. But what about beautiful clean coal? I think it's a pretty obvious crowd that will know that the coal is on the way out. But one thing that I found really interesting is this little piece of work. This is done by Greenpeace, actually. And it shows China, what China's up to in terms of its coal plants. It's closed about 105 plants. And the interesting thing with this graph is the red ones are under construction. So the plants are under construction, they're stopping them anyway. And the reason that they're doing that is because the cheapest form of energy for them in the future they see is going to be solar. So pretty interesting, huh? Here's some data from the US that picks up on this price conversation about solar. This is showing closing. This is a study done by Berkeley Labs about 4 years ago, updated in September, and showing the PPA, the closing PPA price of solar deals, and the different colours are the various states that have been looked at in the US, and of course the size of the bubble is the size of the project. So getting down around the sort of $50, $60 a megawatt hour number now. And look, I think there's an obvious response to this that America's had various tax credit schemes like the PTC and more recently the investment tax credit scheme. But for me, the interesting part of this is the rate of decline. So like back in 2008, we're talking $200 a megawatt hour. We're now sort of talking about deals that are $50 a megawatt hour. Pretty interesting. And if you think about, well, for solar to be awesome, you need some firmness. There are some deals down in that range now that include battery storage as well. So pretty cool. I'd highly recommend the study if you haven't seen it or read it. So while we're talking about battery, this is some data from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Pretty reputable entity, also quite an optimistic one in terms of new energy. Well, they're called Bloomberg New Energy Finance, so obviously they're very, very keen on this stuff. But you can see that effect of that price performance again. Photovoltaics plotted through to 2014, a little bit out of date. Apologies for that. But you can see they're starting to pick up batteries following this type of exponential process as well. So very, very interesting. So sort of behind this exponential growth and these uptake of these emerging technologies is this sort of the learning cycle or experience cycle. We tap into new markets sometimes where sometimes we're encouraged to through subsidies. Sometimes the market just permits it, but that increases demand. The prices decrease, which drives demand, and you have the cycle, and that leads to these exponential changes. And like I haven't dwelt on wind too much. I sort of see wind very much as a mature technology. We heard from Neil earlier, $55 a megawatt hour. That's unsubsidised. That's here in New Zealand. That's pretty good news. And I think talking about deceptiveness in these technologies, the question is it done? It's very tempting to go, oh no, that's as good as it's going to get. It's not going to get any better. 55 is. So the question is it finished? Is it going to continue to decline? Humans, all of us, we tend to have this kind of forecaster bias that we think things are either going to be linear or stay the same. So who knows what will happen. I'm definitely not here to predict the future, but these trends are quite compelling, I think. And I did note a quote from Neil. He said near the last part of his presentation that batteries will never ever be part of the solution to dry year risk, which it's at the moment it's very difficult to believe that they could be. It's a fairly definitive statement. And I just, for some reason, it seemed appropriate to mention it when sort of sharing this quote. Ahmed Zaki Yamani was the Saudi Minister of Energy for many, many years. And I'm not sure that he did make this quote, but I don't think he was the first one to. I think there were others before him that had said it. But just, yeah, interesting. It's hard to say when we're talking about the future, predicting the future. For me, anyway, it's very hard to be definitive about things like that. I want to just move on a little bit. I've got about another 4 or 5 minutes of slides, and then we're going to get into the discussion with the panel. And the next part, we'll just cover a little bit about how this rate of change and how horizons all around us are moving a lot faster. Credit Suisse did this interesting report recently where they looked at the longevity of Fortune 500 companies and also CEOs within them. And I think back in the 1950s and 60s, you could expect to be a Fortune 500 company for 40, 50 years. I think that number's seriously reduced now to less than 20 years. I saw some discussion recently that put it even shorter than that, single digit. So that's quite interesting. And the CEO tenure, of course, shifting as well. So I've put this word templosion. It's not my word. This comes from a sort of futurist that I like to follow and listen to sometimes, Edie Wiener. I'll talk about her in a moment. But just thinking about timescales in our history, we had 10,000 years of this agricultural economy as humans, only really 250 years of an industrial age. We can say we had a 50-year post-industrial age in which there's been something like 4 industrial revolutions, and we're in this information economy at the moment. So I think there's a couple of really interesting questions, and we'll come into the panel on these later and see what we think. And I'm very keen to hear your thoughts as well. But what is the next economy, and what skills should we be building for it? And how long does the information economy carry on for? So I mentioned Edie, worth looking up if you're interested in this type of stuff, but she uses this an acronym, BANG fuel, to sort of guide discussion around the future of learning. It all sounds pretty out there, pretty futuristic stuff, but bits, atoms, antimatter, neurons, I would say nanoscience there as well, genes, ultra and infraspectral energy. I had to look up what that meant. I think ultraspectral energy is like what they're doing in the Large Hadron Collider, trying to find subatomic particles and different energy levels, pretty crazy stuff, and light. So, okay, that's an interesting perspective. I think one of my own perspectives is, well, you've sort of seen us today being pretty public about the fact that virtual reality is an avenue for us when it comes to learning. I think that cyberspace is actually probably really in its infancy. I know it's been around for some time. But when you look at those curves, when you look at the price performance, things are not going to stay the same. Computing's only going to get more powerful. And the impact that has on learning could be quite profound. I mean, you think about a trainee doctor learning about something like, I don't know, a heart murmur. They might want to study a systolic heart murmur. They could read about it in a book and look at a diagram, or they could actually go and sit inside the heart and watch the valve over deflecting and build a visual memory of what that actually means. So, interesting and quite compelling way to think about the future of learning. Just while actually one of the comments that I think it was Olivia that made it in the opening presentation, which was about we should be talking to more. Was it you that said this, Olivia? More different types of people. We should actually be seeking some diversity in who we talk to and how they think and what they do. Right. So to illustrate this, I think it's a really good point, and to illustrate it a little further. I'm going to just call on Doblin and Keeley's innovation framework, which is just one framework. I'm not necessarily pushing it. Personally, I quite like it because the result of their study, they say they discovered that there was always 10 types of innovation. So they did some kind of meta-analysis on thousands of companies and found out that The companies that are innovative, the types of innovation that we're doing could be categorised into 10 different categories across 3 broad categories. So working from left to right, we have profit models, network models, structure and process. So that's how your business is configured. In the middle, you have the product offering, so product performance and the product system. And this is what we tend to think of when we think about innovation. If you start thinking about it for the first time, it's an iPhone, it's a thing, it's a product. So that's in the middle. And then customer experience, so service channel brand, customer engagement. If you start to look at innovation in a framework like this, you start to think about like Apple, customer engagement. I mean, it's in so many of these, it's not funny, but customer engagement, you have to pay $1,500 to go to an Apple launch event, you have to buy tickets. I mean, if Mitten Electronet launched a new service, I don't think we'd have a lot of success selling tickets. So pretty interesting, and deep customer engagement. So what Keeley and Doblin found was that businesses that were using more than one type tended to do better. So here's some of their data, the S&P 500, and then of course companies outperforming them by implementing more of these things. So the point about diversity though is not necessarily about that, it's about where the types of people that think this way come from. And if you look at this figure and you look at the configuration, these things are taught in business schools. In the customer experience place, these things are taught in the social sciences, humanities and design space. And these things are taught in engineering school. So if you sort of subscribe to that innovation model, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Olivia. We need to be talking to others with diverse education, diverse industries that they're in. So that's the end of my presentation. I want to now sort of move on to the panel, but just finish with this great Chinese proverb that I heard recently, and many of you will have heard this before. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. And so, like on that note, I'm going to go to the panel and get the conversation started. And I think because I mentioned you, Olivia, I'd like to start with you actually. One of the things that I think you talk about in your keynote is about agility and firms needing to have that agility. And I just wonder, what are your thoughts? How do you build a culture of change in large companies that might have large company inertia? We want to be more like a startup. What are your thoughts?
This on? You can hear me? Mm-hmm. Great. It's a really good question, and I think it's really difficult because of how established the industry is and how established these large companies are. As part of the Future Power Systems Architecture project, which I mentioned in my keynote, and I've spoken to a few of you about, we were looking at what does agile governance actually look like. And we based it a little bit off some of the learnings of agile project management and agile change management, which you might have heard of. It's quite well known in software, and people are just starting to think about it outside of the software scope and being able to apply it elsewhere. Some parts of it's are very software related, but basically it's a lot about prizing kind of genuine interaction over process and focusing on delivering early and then iterating to get to a more refined answer. I think part of that is actually giving yourself permission to make mistakes and to have that early version that you then give a go and then you iterate. Quite what that looks like in the power sector, I'm not quite sure, apart from the fact that we're, as I've mentioned in my keynote, very risk averse, which is very understandable, but it is a blocker to this kind of thinking and this kind of agility.
Any of the other panelists got thoughts on that particular question around achieving agility?
Yeah, so as a utility who provide electricity to 4 million people, we love standardization. We standardize our design, we standardize our equipment, and for very good reasons. And then bringing that type of thinking is disruption to organizations like ours. But we see the need, and we went through a process of studying how it looks like if we're creating in terms of changing the culture, creating a group of thinkers, or is it better to have it in a corporate level, or it makes sense to have a distributed model and having members all over the company and in metrics way on top of the work, in addition to their work, 40% of their time they look into different types of technologies and enablers or disruption, if you will. And the answer, what we found over a course of 5 years, was the combination of both. Putting aside funding and sponsorship by executive on the top, as well as having champions at different parts of the organizations on the working team and making small bets and not going for a huge change, but the change comes with time. And doing things that we haven't done, but in a very small scale, that doesn't put things that we do at risk. For example, we cannot jeopardize safety. We have to make sure that everybody goes home safe and sound, and to their loved ones and their families. Or keeping the lights on, that's the first responsibility of an electric utility. Having those in mind, at the same time being conscious about the risk and doing things differently. So that's the model that we've been trying to implement in our organization with 30,000 people.
Steve, please help yourself.
I'm seriously not into buzzwords, whether they're agile or scum. So I'm going to give you a couple of real-life examples. I actually had Peter's job when the earthquakes happened in Christchurch. And Iran phoned us up and said, oh, New Brighton's sunk into the sand, and we're going to have to come up with a new substation like that to try and get the power back on to the eastern suburbs. Now, anyone want to guess how long a typical design for a distribution substation would take? That was a question, by the way.
We are encouraging audience participation today too, folks. Happy to cold call if no one's willing to.
3 months. Yeah, at least 3 months. Yeah. Guess how quick the team managed to turn it around? In days, yeah? A matter of days. Now, park that on the side. Another example. Based at Transpower, one of our connected parties comes to us and says, we've got an increasing load on our part of the network. We need a reconfiguration of Transpower's system to allow connection. And what do you reckon? Now, the design team looked at it and said, oh yeah, well, we'll take about 6 or 8 weeks to come back to you in terms of an idea, in terms of how we could start to design. And the client went, well, that's no good. We've got this load coming on really quickly. Now, how many of you work for an industrial company? I can't see from here. I've got these glaring lights. One at the back, yeah? So if you were going to change your load in your industry, how quick could you do that?
Pretty much instantaneously.
Yeah, instantaneously. I love that. Can I change the grid instantaneously? Some bits of it. But go back to this connected party example. The team was so embarrassed that they couldn't meet the timeline using our traditional process that they actually adapted what we had and how we did it. Did that breach using a standard design? No. Did that breach going about it in a different way that compromised safety or reliability or quality? Did it cost the client twice as much? No, it didn't. And the team managed to turn that around by working differently to get a result out to the client. Now my question to the whole floor is, and maybe to my other panel members, is that when at times of crisis like that, do teams operate differently? Yeah. And why can't you adapt some of those real crisis times into how we do work as BAU?
It's an interesting question, really. And I think I'd like to actually throw that to the panel. Thanks, Steve. But it's for me there's a question there about trade-offs, right? I mean, you can have anything depending on what you're prepared to do and not do, right? So I'm interested in the panel's response to Steve's question.
Just one of the items. There's a few things, but one what we found within the Eskom side was the benefit of linking with networking, international networking, mainly through Seagrey, and a lot of our real cutting through a lot of the reinvention of the wheel is that you find that if you've got people with networking that you know you've got similar problems around the world, you can send a single email out and normally get an answer which will, in a few minutes, which will take you months. And we've had problems, for example, on crossrope suspension guy wires which were eroding, and we had a collapsed tower on our 765 kV guide V towers, and it was a circulating current problem, and we didn't really know what the issue was, but I knew that in Finland they had actually had something as well. So I sent an email to the person in Finland, and he said, oh yeah, we've had this problem, we've actually solved it, and he sent me the whole thing with they put an insulator rubber in the guy, and it's got to have a certain specification, and we got that back in a day. So that would have taken us probably maybe about 2 years to research and to find the thing. And there was another example from Virginia Power with Dave Roop had a big problem on his nuclear stations actually, and he found through his contacts that they were having a conference somewhere in China, and he got on a plane, went over, met with the guys, came back, and had a solution within a week. And he said that saved him most probably a good few million. This was in the latest Electra. So that's just an example. And another one, one of the conductor manufacturers wanted to find out about alloys, and they'd been trying for 6 months to actually go through and find out what different alloys there were. And we had a contact on from Japan. We actually sent an email with everything, and there was about 17 different alloys, and half of them they only knew about 3. So we got that back within a day. So the agility comes from also knowing and networking, which normally you find somewhere in the world has got an answer to the problem which you might think they never have got a problem answer for.
That's a great point, and the modern connectedness really seems to be a key theme throughout there. Look, I'm picking up 2 themes going on in that conversation. One of them is about introducing different types of like design thinking, agile type methodologies, and from Olivia and Steve's point about maybe we can do things faster. Maybe we actually can do things differently. And again, I mentioned this before, but my view on that is that somewhere along the line there exists a trade-off. And one of the trade-offs that tends to come into this conversation I've noticed is that of security. And so I guess I just wonder, panel, do we need to, our comms networks are separated with air gaps. We're not necessarily connected to the internet. And if I ask for a show of hands, I'd say I think most people would prefer that we don't get connected to the internet. But do we have to look at that and potentially that security trade-off?
Well, I'll answer that one then.
It's an open question.
Again, I'll give an example. Anyone from Orion out there? Good, you might be able to help me out. So I heard this story from Roger when Roger was the CEO of Orion. Roger went out to the rural community where the reliability of the Orion network wasn't the same as what the CBD was. He turned around and said, do you want to pay more for better system security? Do you want to enable us to upgrade the network and spend more money? It's going to cost you more. Or do you want to stick to your backup diesels that you've got at each of your dairy sheds? And guess what their answer was that Roger told me? You might be able to correct me. They stuck to their diesels. Yeah. Now, there's always a compromise between what you put in place. Like Transpat had an example recently where we had quite a major industry that was hanging off an N connection. This is like N security, no redundancy, no backup, single N connection. We're doing an upgrade of that connection, and we turned around and said for an additional sum of money, which wasn't that much more than we were charging for the basic upgrade, you could have N-1, so you could have complete duplication. And they didn't opt to go for that. Now, whether that was their understanding of risk compared to our understanding of risk, whether it's just purely a financial choice, or maybe Transpower provides such a good service at N that they thought that would be good enough.
Rob, I know you've got a special interest in understanding the challenges around supplying remote areas. I mean, have you got something to add to that?
Well, it is actually a big issue supplied to remote areas, and there's a lot of we've looked at a lot of microgrid type technologies. But there's a few things that we found out. When you put PV and battery in, and you put it per household, the problem is you've got a fairly limited supply. So what we found was that the people in the rural areas would actually, you could run most probably just a colour TV, maybe a light or something like that, and then you've got a limited battery life as well. And they quickly saw this as a second-rate supply. They also saw that if they get a PV and a battery, it's going to take longer for them to get grid. So they started refusing to take the PV and the battery. The other thing that the suppliers of this sort of had to get with a grid you get a unit cost, and if you use the power you pay for it. You might have have a sort of a capacity tariff, part of the tariff, but it's normally an energy part for rural. And so if you don't use it, you don't pay. Whereas with a PV battery, it was almost a lease system, so you had to pay per month. So their argument was, because they were rural, they come to urban for 6 months and they go back home, and they're saying, well, I go away for 3 months and then I come back and now I've still got to pay. You know, it's like you give me a candle, I burn half the candle, then I give you the half candles back and I've got to buy new ones. So they said, well, you can forget about that model as well. So these are the type of challenges that you raise. You think it's a great idea, best thing since sliced bread, and the whole thing falls down. So if you're looking at microgrids, what we're looking at is looking purely at a centralized microgrid supplying households, but as if they're on grid. So they would get the grid tariff, they would get the grid supply. It's just that it's supplied by the beauty about the battery, and that as long as it's secure, is that it's low maintenance. But the problem we had with diesel was, first of all, you had to maintain the thing, and secondly, you couldn't get the diesel to the area because the trucks couldn't go on the roads. And then the actual maintenance, you needed skills which just weren't there. So the concept of microgrid has only really started looking now, and that's because of the renewable and battery and inverter technologies. So in future, it might be an option to have a lot of microgrids and eventually connect with grid, so you'd have the same standards and do networks like that. So we're looking at that kind of stuff.
I think, I mean, just let's move on to microgrids for a little bit, because I know that all of the keynotes have some expertise in this space. And look, a question I wanted to put to the panel is, what is it that catalyses a campus type load to decide that it's going to become a microgrid? What does it take? Steve, you sort of talked to us a bit about some real-world local experience around consumers' relationship with energy. The campus-type loads of the airports, the universities. So what does it take for them to decide that they're going to go and do that?
Is that aiming at me, or can I pass it on to Shay?
I'm
Maybe
purposefully
I can try
asking.
with that.
Sorry, Shay, please. Yeah.
That's fine. For the behind-the-meter type or campus microgrids, there are different drivers for that. One is the cost or poor reliability, depending on where they are. And in Chicago or in Illinois, the cost of electricity is 13 cents per kilowatt hour. So that definitely is not the only driver of installing microgrid behind the meter. But I look at your question a bit differently. That why, from a grid perspective, that for economic reason we have centralized generation for decades and centralized control, and we are looking at it a bit differently. And I talked about microgrid, and it's the things that we had to deal with it is a bit shifting and changing. We had to think about the events that the probability of happening is large, but the consequences are small, and we translate it to reliability. But then, if you think about it, the events that the number of those, they are increasing, the probability of occurrence is small, but the consequences are high. So that means that the design should change. From a centralized control, we have to get into the distributed or a hybrid combination of both. We are installing we are modernizing the grid. That means that we are adding a lot of automation in the system. So what does that translate to? That means that we are going to open the system for more disturbances and cyber attacks, and there are a number of reports that different countries they publish. So taking away that the decision making from a centralized into a distributed level, and not overloading the communication infrastructure, and allowing that the automation devices and the load and the generation, they get coordinated and they function in a distributed level, that goes into creating a case for microgrid. So now you have behind the meter type microgrids at data centers, at manufacturing and campuses, or at university campuses, and they invest a lot of capital in how in those generations, but they are not using it for 90.9% of the time, and it's a waste of capital. So the next step for that is going to be how we can utilize behind the meter generation and resources on the grid when something happens. So first of all, it makes me extremely uncomfortable because the border of the operation between our utility and behind the meter is completely solid. So we are making that border a bit blurry, and we have standards in place to make sure how we maintain the infrastructure that we have. Not necessarily it's the same way on the behind the meter. So these are the things that as industry we have to work through it, and it creates the case of how to create clusters of microgrids. It can be owned by behind the meter, third party, or it can be on the network side of the meter. And the last thing about it is how to measure the benefits of those kind of investments in the grid. It's very easy to calculate the benefit of reliability. There are a number of methodologies out there like ICE calculator, IEEE, there's benchmarking for reliability. And it's very easy to look at the business case and make investments on, for reliability improvement. We don't have such things for resiliency. And it goes back to your first point about inclusion, meaning that we need economists that they look at the impact only from an economic perspective. We need engineers that they can do optimization. We need political science, human science, that they can look at the impact on people's lives. And then we need urban planners who look into the impact, the causal methodologies and algorithms of not only the direct impact, but also the indirect impact of energy and improvement in resiliency to different infrastructure. I hope I answered your question.
Great
I've
answer.
been on and on for it.
No, they're really good. I just wonder if any of the other panelists want to respond to that. I mean, that's a.
Can I add a few comments? Let's go back in history in New Zealand. Let's go back 120 years. What do we have? Did we have a grid? No, we didn't. We had a very distributed generation and local use type model. Yeah, generators popped up down the road, around towns. Electricity was moved locally and it was consumed locally. So why was the grid built? The grid was built to connect bits together, to provide resilience, to enable a market where you could move cheaper power generated somewhere else and supply you where you didn't have enough in that right place. Now, park that on the side. Think about you're running a hospital. Yeah? How do you make the choice about whether to have a backup diesel generator at your hospital, or you rely on either a distributed connection or a grid connection to supply your means? And I think that you're absolutely right in terms of not having the analysis and all the pieces of the puzzle to put things together, to work out who is accountable and where the cost benefits are in terms of driving some of those models.
I just wanted to add to that. There's a couple of things happening, certainly in the UK. I don't know if there are parallels here. A couple of reasons why community energy type or energy group type projects and groups are cropping up. One is very simply because people want to do things greener and better and more independently than of large organisations that they don't necessarily trust. Yep. And of course there's a larger driver in the UK because we don't have quite so much renewable generation as you guys do. So you'll get groups of people that are clubbing together and buying large-scale renewables. So they'll club together and buy a couple of wind turbines. They're not normally fed into a microgrid, and they're not normally electrically connected. And there's nuances about how the supply, the retailer setup is in the UK that means they can't actually necessarily directly even buy their own generated electricity. So it's all quite far removed. But there's those kinds of groups, as well as kind of group buying of low carbon technologies and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the warm, fuzzy feeling side of it. These are people that want to kind of go out on their own and do things in a better way. And then the other side of it is you'll get a generator that wants to connect to the grid and can't connect to the grid. Either it's far too expensive or the amount of time it will take to get the transmission reinforcements is far too long and much longer than they want. So people are actually considering private wire directly supplying loads. I don't think it's actually that common, but I know that people are definitely considering it, and that's just a failure of what we have at the moment.
But is it a failure, or are we actually, should we be worried? Like, honestly, like, I work for Transpower. I don't mind if someone produces a microgrid somewhere.
No, it's not that people should mind. It's just, by failure I mean, there are already wires there. There are already wires that are connecting to these two people, and or these two properties, I should say. And actually, if someone did the maths better, if someone managed the networks better, if that happened, then they wouldn't need to put in a lot more investment to bury more cable. So it feels like the processes and the lack of this more properly managed networks is getting in the way of something that should be cheap and easy.
So it's a point about maximising the efficiency of the existing assets, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a really good point. I want to go back to something that you were talking about before, Steve, and just about obviously the asset focus that I know you have, and we're here in this discussion getting very excited about new technologies and exponential change and all this stuff. But look, you talked about the grid 100 years ago. And we've got some very old assets still on our network. So, tell us about ageing assets, and what have we got the focus right?
Well, let me go for another Ask the Audience question. So how many of you work for companies who own assets in terms of distribution, transmission, generation assets? A lot of you, yeah? So what do you do when they get old? That was the question, need an answer? Go on. What do you do when they get old? It depends. Yeah, it does really depend. How many of you plough a lot of OPEX money in to try and maintain them and keep them going? Yeah. At what point in time do you turn around and give up with that and replace it? Yeah. And there's some good analysis that can be done to work out when replacement of the asset is the right choice. Probably slightly different than your car, where there's probably a bit more emotions involved in your car, but the same principle. You can keep your old car going forever by replacing little bits and maintaining it, but there'll be some point in time where it's more cost effective to actually dispose of that one and buy a new one. Now, let's turn around. When were a lot of the conductors, I'm talking grid scale conductors, installed in New Zealand? Marshall sat there. Marshall, I know the answer for this one.
The 220 grid was built between the 50s and early 60s.
Beautiful. Who can tell me how long a conductor will stay in the air? It does depend on the location, Dave. That's a very good point. So in your average location, how long would you expect a conductor to last?
I'm going to give you guys a chance to ask Steve some questions in a minute, by the way.
Yep.
25 to 30 years in a highly contaminated zone, and then 100 years in a non-contaminated zone, as long as the average population damage.
Beautiful. So spot on answer from Dave there. And before Pete tells me off for rambling on too long, basically if you look at the profile of when those assets were built and the profile of replacements, Transpower's got this wall of wire challenge coming up. It may not hit us in the next 5 years, it may not hit us in the next 10, but you look out further from that, you had this hump, like Marshall said, of investment back here, you're going to have this hump of potential investment in the future. Only if you need the grid though. So if you can solve out how I can get rid of parts of the grid, I won't have to spend money replacing it, and then because of that, your electricity bills are not going to go up. There's the challenge for you.
So I think on that note, we've got about 30 minutes or so to run. But I would like, at this point, we'll go back to the panel, but at this point I'd like to hear from you guys. So let's have some questions for the panel. I don't know if we've got a roving mic. We seem to be able to hear each other on without it, but who's got a question?
Brian at the back.
A real tricky question. I learned a new word this week, so I want you guys to tell me, what's a blockchain going to do that affects the power system?
What's a blockchain going to do that affects the power system? Any volunteers?
You want to answer?
I'm happy to say something on this.
Good.
So there's lots of talk about blockchain and distributed ledger, etc. It's quite often the answer when someone talks about the huge problem of peer-to-peer, the problem about the amount of data that you have to exchange and the amount of transactions you have to keep track of if you're talking about genuine peer-to-peer with a n by n matrix where n is the amount of properties you have in your country. I think that my feelings on that is that whilst the way we do it might be something like a distributed ledger, and that could be quite a good mechanism. I think there's a lot of thinking to do between now and then into what that actually looks like and what that needs to be. And I think the tendency to say distributed ledger as a bunch of power engineers who, sorry to say, most of us don't really understand it and are hoping it's just going to solve our problems, it's slightly dangerous. I think we need to make sure we're thinking about it properly.
Yeah, I fully agree, Olivia. And I mean, the blockchain is an example, fair and square, of an exponential technology. It requires numbers to be effective. It's developing at a pace a bit like that. And so, will we own and understand how it gets implemented or how it affects our industry, or will someone from outside do something that affects us? Which in a way is, forgive me for the buzzword, but it's a way of definition of disruption. Change is fine. If you're not aware that it's coming, then it's disruption. So I think it's a great question. Any other questions for the panel?
It's all about innovations and new technologies, and if we don't innovate, we will die. And each room has an elephant in it. The question is, do you see it, and how big is the elephant? I would say that the innovation room has probably more than one elephant, and one of them, unfortunately, could be corporate structure and corporate thinking. And the best example is the Kodak example. A small inventor from the Kodak couldn't circumvent that big corporate structure. And another example is, that many breakthrough innovations are actually made by outsiders, not by research and development companies, which became highly corporatized. So the question is, how do we circumvent those elephants in the room? How do we make elephants happy and go ahead? Thank you.
I think that's a great question. To sort of close the circle on the opening story from my side anyway, I sort of see what you're describing as a bit like a corporate immune system, or possibly even in an industry's immune system. So over to you, panel. What are the elephants, and how do we tame them? I'm gonna cherry pick somebody then. So let's start with you, Olivia. Innovation ninja.
I think you make a really good point. I think one of those elephants is absolutely corporate structure, and it comes back to the first question that you asked about trying to get very big companies who have a way of working that has worked very well for a long time to change that way of working. So that's probably one of them. And I've talked a little bit about some of the ways that we could try and tackle that, although it's not an easy thing to do at all. And is not just the fault of the companies. It's absolutely the structure around them, regulation and everything else. Just trying to think if there's other obvious...
So let me throw another angle on it. I think it goes way beyond company structure. And I would use the big fluffy word culture in there as well.
Yeah.
Like, how many of you out there having ideas of doing something better, or thinking, why on earth are we doing it like this? I like to change it, but you can't, or you feel like you can't. Yeah. My question is, why do you feel like that, and how can you make it different? Yeah. And I think that is one of the bigger constraints we got. That might be compounded by structure. But I think getting around that one will move a lot of things forward quicker.
I think it's a great point, Steve. Look, early in my tenure as GM of Mitten Electronet, I went and talked to Callaghan Innovation about innovation. We wanted to launch an aggressive innovation program, and the first name that came to head was Callaghan Innovation. They must know something about it. And I got introduced to a really enthusiastic account manager there, and met his name is Rob Lawrence, fantastic guy. If you're in Christchurch, I'd recommend that you meet him. The first meeting I went to him said, look, should we have, bean bags and poles and slides connecting the floors, and should we do a day a month of innovation, and should we do this and we should do that? And he said, no, there's really only one thing that you need to do, and that's to build a culture of innovation. So much like what you've said, Steve. The how that you do that, of course, is the bit that's interesting and probably tailored to every organisation. What are your thoughts, Rob?
What we try to do, well, basically just as an example from Eskom, we use the Seagrey model, which is a virtual structure of networking, people getting together and solving problems. And the one we found was a big problem with the innovation side was you got the idea, what do you do with it? So you can tell your boss about it, but what does he do about it? It goes into the too difficult tray, and he eventually forgets about it and hopes to go away. So what we did was we actually set up a whole lot of mirror structures very similar to the Seagrey structure within your organisation. So you got all the groups coming in, and they chat about it. And we set up a system whereby you can actually put in any idea, change to standards, this does not work too well, so on and so forth. That goes through a governance process, and then it eventually gets implemented, or it goes into research, or it gets chucked out. But if it gets chucked out, you have a sort of register that, look, we've thought about this and we chucked it out because of this, rather than to sort of say, well, yeah, that looks good, now go and do your job. And we found that's working pretty well, but it's taken, we started it off in the late 80s. It's taken about a good few years to get going. It takes about 5 years to actually get it going. And there's a lot of resistance among trying to break down barriers between departments as to who's responsible for what. If a guy in substation comes up with a line suggestion, they don't normally get well received. So it's that kind of culture you have to break down, but it can actually work. Not as it's always improvement, but there is some option around that. Yeah.
Shay, what's your experience of organisational culture? And
they say culture eats the strategy for breakfast, and that's true. There are two things that you mentioned. They're very good examples I can bring. The solution coming from outside and internally looking for a problem to solve it, it's not really, working. A good example of it, we were given these, initially when we started creating this corporate innovation, they come with these Google goggles, and they said, well, let's find, this is innovative, let's use it. And so people were scratching, so how can I use these Google goggles, and what problem it's going to solve for me? And it's externally imposed rather than something internally created, so that made us to think about, we have to create these teams internally that they can identify the problems and then they partner. We can't do it all alone, but creating a public-private partnership that would help to solve the problems that they already exist in the business. The other thing, and then creating it like a governance and approvals and for budget and your boss and the boss's boss, and it goes all the way. We created a growth board and a platform called Innovation Hub. So people can go in and they can submit their ideas either anonymously or by their names, and there's a group of people that they go through those ideas, and then they get funding from corporate to implement their ideas. They get resources and they get support. Initially, there were a lot of resistance that, well, instead of replacing a pole and making sure that our reliability is improved, you want to invest in this cool idea. So those cool things, it was not really, those innovative ideas, they were not really well received and they were resistant, but it takes time to celebrate both failure as well as successes that would help organization. That has helped us tremendously. We have a long way to go, but just quick examples of how those structures and those barriers and silos can get broken.
It's interesting. I think we have an interesting relationship with failure in our business, because we tend to conflate it with something's gone wrong. There's been an asset's failed, that type of thing. So I think you make a very good point. On the early part of your point, Shay, in terms of organisational culture and innovation and a culture of innovation, do we always have to have a problem to solve? Should we always expect to have a problem to solve, or should we or should we have a degree of experimentation where we don't necessarily, we don't set out to fix problem A or, achieve business case B?
The combination of both. So there are efficiencies that they can get improved. At the same time, there are things that we've never done, but they come by experiment and then building up on those. I can give you an example of on both sides. I talked yesterday, on Wednesday, about the challenge that is in front of us in Illinois about how to calculate the behind-the-meter type distributed energy resources in the grid, and you pay the owner of that. That type of calculation doesn't exist. And then it comes about creating that partnership that I talked about between people with different backgrounds to create that type of calculation. We have created that framework of having an economist on on a team. That's something that historically we don't really have, an economist on our staff, and engineers and people they can do optimization. This is not about like a problem. This is about solving a problem, and about experimenting things. It's not about at ComEd, before having smart meters, we had meter readers. They had to go out and read the meters. And one of the safety issues that we were dealing with, it was like dogs like biting people. And a couple of meter readers, they created an app that, it speaks like different languages for people who live on those like different houses. And then it says that that house has a dog, so it gives the route. So these are like a couple of examples that it's a bottom-up created in the organization by getting support from them.
Cool. That's a cool story. I mean, Steve, Transpower obviously represents an image of stability in the market in New Zealand. I mean, how does Transpower what does Transpower think about the concept of experimentation, or what does experimentation mean to Transpower?
It's really funny how people perceive big corporates, isn't it? Yeah. Like, having sat outside Transpower, like I've worked for Meridian, I've worked as a consultant, I've worked in a variety of areas, and everyone saw Transpower as big, fat, slow, gold plating. Yeah. But if you actually come in and talk to the wonderful engineers we've got at Transpower, there's a lot of really clever thinking ideas that go on. Some things that are tried which don't have a problem to solve, that might create something which does help solve a problem. However, I will raise the point of I think there's some fundamental things wrong in terms of how our industry is regulated or funded in terms of allowing innovation to become right. And let me provide a couple of examples. Take PowerCo, put their recent CPP in. Yeah. Out of this much, they probably got about this much of their innovation money which they put in there. Yeah. And when we were looking at this, because of course we're putting up our next regulatory submission to the Commerce Commission in December, we thought, well, how do we define the innovation funds that we need to be creative, to try different things, and to think outside the box? If you can't link them directly through to a tangible benefit or a problem, or actually know the solution that you're going to solve, the regulator is almost like, nope, I don't think the public will be quite happy funding that. Yep. And so I don't know how many of you others have challenges. Maybe it's just your CFO who will look at it and go, well, tell me the cost benefit, will we pay back on that, and what am I going to get? And you go, well, hang on, we haven't even worked out what we're doing, even though how we're doing it, or even what it's going to solve yet. And trying to make a business case like that fly is extremely hard. Now, I also don't agree with having a separate innovation group within a business. I think innovation should occur at any parts of the business, because I reckon that's where some of the best ideas are. However, you do need some visibility about what's going on. So how you make that work, I think, is quite important.
Great. Okay.
By the way, if I could promote one thing, Peter. I mentioned the wall of wire earlier. I gave you the challenge to say, how do we get rid of the grid, because that will solve my problem. However, if you've got some really clever ideas about how we can keep the grid and solve my wall of wire without your price of electricity going up, please give me a call.
Steve, while we're talking about the grid and you know, and trying to think about the future and accelerating change in these things, I mean, earlier Neil Barclay talked about optionality and how in his world, you know, consenting wind turbines, you know, 7-8 years ago has left him with somewhat stranded consents that he's got to go back and, you know, and re-look at. You know, and Transpower's just issued this Te Maori Hiko report, which looks at the future, it looks at generation mix, and it looks at you know, a plethora of scenarios. I mean, what does optionality mean for Transpower, you know, when thinking about the future?
I'm having all the questions today. I don't know if this is fair. Let me draw an example. Brian spoke this morning. Where is Brian? He's disappeared. He was behind Bob. Is he lying down? Yeah. Oh, he's just left. Damn. Brian mentioned this morning that he thought that coal and nuclear were the way to go, and that climate change was something else. Yep. Put the opinion out there. But Brian wasn't the only person who, over the last couple of days, had turned around and said, why doesn't Transpower consider nuclear as an option for the future by 2050? Yeah, really good question. How many people thought that nuclear might be an option?
For sure.
Or political, yeah, difficult question. Yeah, quite a few hands out there. Now, let's get rid of a myth to start with. When I grew up as a nipper, I was based in the UK and I designed protection systems for nuclear power stations. I then went on to build part of Sizewell B, which was the first and the last pressurised water reactor they built. And so I've probably got a bias towards nuclear power. Yeah, but we haven't included nuclear power in terms of our mix. And I'll tell you why. How many of you are planning to build a nuclear power station in the next 25 years?
How many of you are planning to build a nuclear power station in the next 25 years, I think?
Yep, 25 years.
Yeah, we must have been.
Let's just count the hands.
Damn, I haven't got any hands.
Zero.
Out there. Okay, standard nuclear power station that you get out there is about 1,200 to 1,500 megawatts electrical. Yeah. What would that do to reserve market in New Zealand if that suddenly tripped as a base load? Because nuclear's run at base load. How would you provide systems stability from an operational perspective if you suddenly got 1,500 megawatts popping off because something went wrong with the reactor? Yeah. However, yeah. So that creates problems. Don't mention the earthquake risk, but you can come up with some clever designs to get around that. And you could turn around and say, is it safe? I'll leave you to own debate on that. But there's some really good control systems and protection systems out there now, better than I designed 20 years ago. But let me turn around and say, is there an option for nuclear? And there might be. And I like to, it isn't in our current base case scenario. But if someone can build a reactor which is 50 to say 200 megawatts big, can be encased, doesn't need refueling for 20 years, is seismically proof that it would suit a New Zealand climate, why wouldn't you install one here? You might have to change the Nuclear Act and all those other bits of politics and maybe change the government and the whole view of half the government and the opposing political parties and vote someone else in. But there's many different barriers, but I'm going to be very agnostic and say I'll be very happy to accept any generation mix on the system, provided it provided a robust, reliable, secure system that was economic.
Yeah, I think there's obviously, in New Zealand anyway, a culture or societal angle to that as well. For some reason we recoil when people mention nuclear, but I think you're right, Steve, the arguments are, you know, let's put it on the table, let's have a look. The technology is changing. Look, I just want to, we've got about, by my watch, about 10 minutes to run. So before we come back for the last round of questions, I'm just going to sort of go full circle to the theme, and that is around accelerating change and, you know, and how we kind of navigate and understand. And I want to go to you again, Olivia. You know, you and I have talked a bit about, you know, the different modern service relationships like the Airbnbs, like the Amazons, and they seem to move at this accelerating pace. You know, it's a dizzying pace, both in terms of market cap on the companies themselves, but also how their stack of technology fits together. You know, how do we keep up?
That's a really good question. I'm sure lots of people want to know the answer to that. If you talk about this wider energy system that I mentioned in my keynote, so not just generators, transmitters, transmission, distribution, and regulation, but the wider set of people that include technologies beyond the meter and local services. Of course, all of that is changing quickly, and we're getting energy related products that are being are innovating and changing that quickly. So that's really exciting. It's all happening at the moment outside of the control or really the reach of the traditional power sector. If we could change that, then there's a massive opportunity to do something with it and to, I guess, collaborate with these kinds of technologies and to take advantage of them. At the moment, I think that there needs to be a step somewhere where we go from what we've got at the moment, which is a very simple, easy to understand, and there are benefits to that, service relationship, to something that is a more complex platform base. Certainly in the UK, there is regulation in place to prevent that happening at the moment. So there were rules put in place a few years ago that meant that our suppliers, so retailers, could only offer a certain number of different tariffs, and they had to be very simple because it was their opinion that they were getting too complicated and people, particularly vulnerable customers, didn't understand them, and if they didn't understand their tariffs, then they couldn't work out if they were getting a fair deal. Which is a really valid point and really good thinking behind it. But of course that rule says you can only offer, I can't remember how many it is, maybe 3 different tariffs. Suddenly cuts off all this opportunity for different ways of doing things and different services. So it's that kind of thing that we have to work past and change, I think. And there needs to be this step change from this very simple relationship to a platform that allows something more complicated, but more flexible and more tailored.
Can I add the word customer choice in there as well?
Absolutely,
Because
yes.
they need to make a choice, but we need to sort of guide them the right way.
Yes, and equally there's lots of talk of making sure that people that choose not to participate can't be left behind. They can't be expected to, their lights can't go off because they've decided that they don't want to offer a service, which is sort of obvious to say. But equally they can't pay, unfairly much more because they haven't decided to offer a service.
It's a really interesting social angle, isn't it? Because customers they don't know what they want or what they need. So it doesn't seem like a level playing field the way you describe it. I'd be really interested to hear from you, Shay, on this topic.
As a network operator, I see that the future of our business is going to get into a platform similar to what Olivia said. We have 3 platforms that we can monetize it. One is a physical network, our cables, transformers, poles that we can transfer electrons from point A to point B. That enables a certain number of transactions and certain types of transactions. The second platform is a data platform. We own fiber, we own a 900 megahertz mesh network, and that can enable different types of, again, data transactions. Let me be specific, you are in a real estate industry, you can put your noise sensor and come up with the neighborhoods that impact the cost of real estate. So you will sit on or you utilize my platform. The third one is a social platform. As a utility, we touch every single customer in our service territory. With 4 million customers from residential to commercial, industrial, we have relationships with them. We send a bill to them. We listen to them. We hear about the issues that they have. So those 3 platforms, they are the platforms that would be monetizing the benefit of those transactions is the future that we see in our industry. But a few things about it. If you think about Uber, hopping on an Uber and going to 2 blocks away is not equal to jumping on an Uber and then going to 40 miles away to the airport. The delta, the money that Uber as a platform monetizes is different for each transaction. So what it needs today is taking the time, not only looking at the different types of transactions, what's beneficial. Now translate it back to our business. Calling to our call center and complaining about whatever is a transaction, but it's not a beneficial transaction. It's only an OpEx for us. It's an O&M cost, that operational cost that hurts us and it hurts our customers. So right now we are thinking about the network economy theoretically says that the number of transactions you have, your platform is stronger. That's how they built the telecommunication industry 40 years ago, but that doesn't necessarily apply to us today. So we are right now on the process of thinking through what transactions are beneficial, but in terms of the size and in terms of the types, and how we can optimize it to the benefit of our customers and our shareholders and employees.
Thanks, Shay. Really interesting insights. I'm just going to, we're coming to near the end, but I'm going to change direction for this, let's say last question or nearly last question. We'll see how we go. I just want to hear from you, Rob. I know, look, you've got a great deal of expertise when it comes to dynamic line rating and increasing line ratings and so forth, depending on weather conditions. You know, I saw a figure recently in this concept of accelerating change again that talked about 50 billion Internet of Things devices being connected to the network in, I think, the next 5 years, an astonishing uptake. And in parallel with that, this concept of, you know, increasing price performance of computing means that computing, you know, is tending towards free. You know, you can buy for $30 a Raspberry Pi that has more computing power than a computer 20 years ago, right? So I'm just interested, you know, 50 billion devices, it's nearly free. Talk to us about the impact this is going to have in that area of, particularly of, you know, dynamic line rating.
Well, the dynamic line rating is really just to use your existing weather data to actually determine your rating of the line in real time. So the devices that they have now to actually do that are becoming a lot cheaper, whereas in the past it was really quite an expensive exercise. So I see that you can most probably start looking at benefits not only on dynamic line rating, but monitoring of equipment and the whole thing, bringing it in. The big trick is not getting the data. The big trick is how to use the analytics and then put that into the operator and then take action on it. That's really the issue. And a lot of the dynamic line rating projects have failed because they really lose that man-machine interface at the end. But if you now start looking at automated power flows, which now you can do a lot more with fax devices on the systems, you're now starting to get to the thing where you can actually use intelligent switching. So you can use your fax devices, dynamic line ratings, stability studies, all done automated, to actually start managing your power flow a lot more effectively. So there's something where you can actually start, and they're looking at that they're looking at that kind of thing in the protection environment with wide area protection systems, where you're actually assessing the network in really quick time and then making decisions around that network operation and in that. So I see that whole lot can actually start merging. But at the moment it's sort of like going, fairly quickly. So I can see we're going to get evolution in that area.
Okay, that's an exciting sounding development.
Peter, can I throw a comment in there?
Yeah, please do.
I won't comment on line rating. I think dynamic line rating is a great thing, and it can be used for specific purposes in terms of getting more out of your current system. But I would also then challenge the whole paradigm of how you go about planning. There's a real incremental way of planning, and it's been around for hundreds of years. And I would say, how do we turn that on its head? Now let me explain really briefly. If you've got a slight load increase, you look at what the options are to do to try and manage your peaks without investing. So you might have dynamic line rating, you might have some form of load shedding or some special protection scheme or a bit of demand response. You get a bit more load increase and you have this real incremental approach to tweaking and changes on your system. Yeah, I call them sticky plasters, yep. And you keep sticking sticky plasters on it. Now what happens after about 10 or 15 years, that you look at your system and go, oh God, if only I knew what it would be like in 15 years time, I wouldn't have planned it like this and I would have built something completely different. How would you turn around at the start and go, I'm going to build something completely different that's going to allow that future, which is more economic than sticking all of these little sticky plasters on that are incremental and have all their own complications that can just make life simpler. So again, hey, sorry Peter, it's more of a question than an answer. But if someone can innovate to create that environment, ring me up again.
It's a brilliant example. I mean, it's, you know, if the the optimum solution requires a complete knowledge of the future need, doesn't it? So, and I think it plays into this discussion about whether or not the types of design methodologies that Olivia was talking about would work for us, where we cycle and repeat based on a short horizon, could very well end up with some sort of compromise in terms
But when you're buying assets that last 50 to 70 years, you don't have that luxury.
No.
If I had an
I
IT
agree.
system that I threw away every 3 or 4 years, no problem.
If you don't mind, I just add one comment to what you said in terms of a question and a challenge. They are about planning. I'm a planner in heart. That's where I grew up in utility. But it's our planning process is a closed process within network operator. That's not something that we open it publicly, and we plan for the worst day in 10 years, and a lot of different utilities around the world, they plan it that way. But thinking about differently in terms of non-wire alternatives, that if you have load growth and in a very very small area, how you can communicate that need externally and allow a mix of different types of technology behind the meter, a combination of a lot less solar, but combination of solar, battery, CHP, and energy storage, and how a combination of that with dynamic line rating and demand response can avoid that type of investment. It's a lot more comfortable to go with the investment of cables and transformers because that's what we are familiar with, but opening that and communicating that and externally, that can avoid that type of investments in the
But
grid.
I would say we're already there. I would say that certainly Transpower publish a transmission planning report at least every 2 years, if not every year, and a system security report. And every investment, we're now really looking out there to say what is the non-transmission alternatives. Now, to use one of Peter Berry's famous lines, quick as a flash, what comes in? Very little. And so I don't think the industry's set up there to be able to respond in terms of what some of those alternatives are. And I would encourage the industry to think how we can solve that, because then that creates a best for New Zealand option rather than just something that a distribution or transmission company can do.
I think that's like a great challenge. And look, in the closing 3 or 4 minutes, I'm going to come back to you guys. So I see Richard's primed, ready to go.
Thanks, Pete. Listen, on those last couple of comments, it's got me thinking, and maybe going back to the comment earlier around the large number of projects that we've consented in the past, and Pete, you and I and others in the room have been involved in consenting projects, knowing fair well that they may be in an order of priority may not get built for some time, and they may not align anywhere close with any transmission assets that do or don't swing past them. And so it gets me, and don't get me wrong, I'm a firm believer in free market economics and competition. But Neil spoke this morning about the volume of projects that are sitting there and what Meridian might be doing separately about getting some of them launched. And it takes me back to thinking about the appropriateness of thinking of centralised planning and what role it has in more optimised solutions for a country like New Zealand. And just my question is, where do you see that in solving some of your problems, Steve? It's maybe it's difficult as a monopoly transmission to say, listen, we're happy to consider things that come along as they come along. But actually, if you really want to be optimising solutions for the better for New Zealand Inc., then maybe we need to think a bit more openly and more agile and innovative together in order to achieve that. And how would we do that?
I think that's a really good question, Richard. First of all, I'll say is that Transpower is not a central planner, but we do publish information that allows people to make decisions within the free market. Having sat down with at least 2 of the generators in the last week, they are all struggling to make a case, to put an investment case to their board about building new generation. There's 3,000 megawatts of consented wind out there, and people are struggling to get any of it away. Yet we're talking about the potential for quite large increases in electricity if those scenarios are correct. It's a real chicken and egg. Until you get rid of that uncertainty, the people who invest in those businesses, which are either part or government owned, will play a really conservative game in terms of their rate of return. And so who's going to go first? Do you build a Clyde and have excess capacity? Or do you wait until you're constrained and you can't provide the power and then someone has to do something about it? I haven't got the answer. I know the UK is talking about a central architect, but I don't know how they're getting on with that.
Just as a point of interest, the idea of central planning is not one that goes down very well in the UK. And actually, one of the issues that we've had with the Future Power Systems Architecture project is that people mistake it for central planning, and then that turns people off it, whereas it's absolutely not that. I wondered if I could just ask a quick question. Maybe it's something that we answered very quickly. You say you released lots of information about your plans and are hoping that the market does something about it. Yeah. Could this be that innovators don't see this as a useful source of information, don't know about it? The kinds of people that you really need to engage are probably outside of the power industry and maybe just don't know about the information.
So to answer that, I think you're partially correct, but also not fully correct. And let me explain why. A lot of the consultation we do put out is absolutely public out there.
Yeah.
But the people who read it are probably the people who are interested.
Yes.
However, very enlightening, we have been approached by several overseas people with large sums of money who are looking at distributed energy systems, who are completely separate to the usual bunch of people you get out there who would typically build generation or distributed generation projects. And so I think time will change very quickly in terms of different people and players in the market who are willing to look at stuff. We provide a lot of information, and I hope it's useful for the people around the room. And if it isn't, you need to let me know. And I also need to work out how we can get it out there more to others who might have some clever idea of how to solve a problem. Good question.
Guys, personally I could talk about this for another hour at least, but we have been here 90 minutes. I'm conscious we need to wrap up, so I will ask Bob Taylor to come and thank the panellists, and thank you all very much for your questions and input.
Well, what a perfect way to bring things together for us at the conclusion of our conference. Peter, you've done an amazing job convening this session. In fact, we might keep you on for next year, so well done. Look, I'm not going to attempt to sum up the discussions. It was very informative, but what I would like to say is that our panellists have brought us fantastic insight and some very valuable kind of lines of thought, and in fact beautifully brought together the engineering, technology and innovation theme of our conference, and we really appreciate what you've been able to do for us. So I suppose a couple of just quick takeaways that kind of resonated a wee bit with me. The importance of collaboration, and at the opening of this panel session there was this kind of ability to solve problems, the fact that everybody globally is sharing in the same kind of challenges, and we really now have the ability to get very quick response and good solid advice in relation to how to deal with our challenges. Nothing's that unique. We all probably have similar experiences. But I think the other key point for me is the one that has come up 2 or 3 times during the conference, and that's about industry reputation. It is, whether we're talking about dry year response or the range of options that we're providing our customers, our ability to be agile, provide the right price structures, our focus on delivering safe, environmentally sensitive solutions, giving people certainty around investment. But the underlying point there is that the importance of industry reputation, and particularly the trust that's placed in us in terms of being leaders going forward. So, look, I found this panel session really good, and Shay, Rob, Stephen and Olivia, we really do appreciate your input at this stage. So please join together with me and show your appreciation. Right, well I think we're moving towards the end, so if I give our panellists an opportunity just to leave the stage. Richard, I think you're set to go. We're now going to make the awards around the papers at the conference, so I'll hand over to Richard to do that for us.
Thank you, Bob, and just want to reiterate, I thoroughly enjoyed that panel session again, and thank you, Peter, and all the panellists. It was thoroughly enjoyable. 66 papers, 450 delegates,
250 exhibitors, 3 panel sessions, 6 keynote speakers. It's been a busy few days, and you've all played a very important part in that. I just want to first of all thank a few people. One, to all of you that have travelled here, and some from afar, all those people that have spent the time and energy preparing papers and presentations and delivering those over the last couple of days, and to thank the judging and chairing panels for the work that they've done in convening the sessions and keeping things on time and making some sense of who we think has done really well. And listen, it gets harder and harder every year that we come to this conference, because the quality and of delivery and preparation of the papers is getting better and better. But we have spent some time this afternoon looking through some scoring over the last few days, and it's my pleasure now to make some announcements around the awards for 3 or 4 categories of papers. So that's where we are. So the best, we have 5 categories: a member and non-member best paper, and a student best paper award, and then the IET best paper for presentation. And then the People's Choice Award, which you have all hopefully participated in voting using the what's it called, Show Gizmo app. And I think we have had an increased level of participation using the app this year. And the board and I are going to spend some time in the next few months thinking about how we might extend that going forward, such that it's more of you involved in making the choices around these papers rather than a select group of board members and other volunteers. But we'll come back to you on that next year. But I am pleased to say that we do have some winners this year, and for the best paper category for a member is a paper presented by Alistair Reid from Orion, New Zealand, and his paper was entitled Safety in Design. Is Alistair still here? So perhaps next year also we'll have the paper awards straight after lunch, or before lunch. So Lance, we'll make sure that Alistair gets his award, so please join me in congratulating Alistair. And the best paper, non-member paper, has gone to Thomas Smolka from Rheinhausen, Australia, and his paper was entitled Benefits of Using Voltage Regulation Distribution Transformers for Grid Integration of Renewables. Lessons learned from first installation in Australia and New Zealand. Quite a long paper title, he didn't win for that reason. Is Dr. Thomas Smolka still here? He's left as well? Okay, well please pass on our regards and congratulations to Thomas. Are you able to pick up on his behalf? Are you from the... No? No. Okay. We'll make sure we'll get that to him. Right, perhaps we'll have more luck with our student papers. This year we had, I think, 6 or 7 really strong student papers, and we couldn't choose between 2, actually, so we're going to award 2 awards this year. And they are to Saifa Al-Sashit from Auckland University. Is Saifa still here? Oh, that's good news. And Arif Ahmed from the Robinson Research Institute. Is Arif still here? So Saifa, congratulations. Your paper was around investigating travelling wave fault location techniques for distribution assets. And And that's a good reminder too, to also thank all the student volunteers that have helped over the last few days. And you know, without you, we would have struggled really. Running around with microphones and making sure everything sticks on time is really appreciated. And the final category was for, the second last category is for the IET Best Presentation. So this is just on the presentation, not on the written paper. And that has gone to Ling Song Zing from Wellington Electricity. And Ling Zhong's paper was entitled Wellington Electricity's Emerging Technology Roadmap. There's all sorts of stuff comes with it, doesn't there, Pete?
Yeah, that's right.
Certificates, plaques. We'll get it out to you. What are they? And thank you. And then the last category, don't go far. The last category was also for People's Choice, and that's also been picked up by Ling Zhong Jian, so congratulations. So that shows in many respects that the system works, both the judging and the people's choice. Bit of alignment in the... So, he needs a box.
It's not alcoholic.
Not alcoholic. So thank you very much, and please join me again in thanking all of the award winners.
Right, I take it's my cue. So well done to the recipients of the paper awards. And again, those papers are such a central part of the conference, and the ongoing standards around the papers has been amazing. So look, it now really falls upon me to move to bring the conference towards an end. As President of the Electricity Engineers Association, organisers of this annual conference and exhibition, I have the privilege of officially closing this conference by first saying a few words. It's been a great return to Auckland after 3 years in Wellington. We've seen some excellent presentations, engaging panel sessions, active discussions, a bustling exhibition hall, inspirational award winners, and moreover, over the last 2.5 days. A special thanks to Landis & Gear, the principal sponsors of this event, and to all the other sponsors and exhibitors who helped make this annual power engineering event such a success. We appreciate the support of international industry organisations that have provided keynote speakers from IET, IEEE, PES and SEGRE. And thanks to all the paper presenters. Your enthusiasm to share your knowledge and expertise is a great strength of our industry and a fine example to young engineers as they progress in their chosen careers. And of course, to over 900 conference delegates and visitors we have had here this week, a special thank you. Over the last 2.5 days, we have certainly explored the key conference themes of engineering, technology and innovation. It seems a long time ago now, but on Wednesday we had 2 excellent keynotes, Olivia Carpenter giving us some clear ideas about supporting innovation in our industry, and Shay Baremarad offered a glimpse of a resilient future involving a community microgrid. The EEA is a founding partner of the engineering industry's diversity agenda, and our job is made easier by seeing so many industry high flyers who have got there on their merits. A Young Engineer of the Year is also female, not for the first time either. We're glad that Rebecca Marks stuck with power engineering, a power engineering career rather than opening a cake shop. Don't be afraid to dream big, she said. We should also celebrate and learn from our Workplace Safety and Engineering Excellence Award winners. They showed that this is an innovative and practical industry. And this year we have seen many demonstrations of how our industry is striding into the future, technologically and in terms of our people. Yesterday, keynote Rob Stephen, the Global President of SEGRE, discussed some interesting issues facing our industry and also showed that we are thinking ahead. The concept of a worldwide electricity grid is merging with the technologies we need to achieve it. Ashley Johnson of Landis & Gear discussed the coming explosion in the number of connected devices we may be dealing with soon, and gave us some food for thought on how we might use all that data and possible control. The industry dinner last night was a very enjoyable social event. The university scholarships and professional development awards were so well deserved. And the after-dinner speaker, Mike Alsop, was truly inspirational. I'll be working on my mind map when I get home. Today's keynotes show that we are not short of leadership here in New Zealand. Alison Andrews of Transpower presented on their electricity future. A presentation on their electricity future was fascinating. And it's great news to see how much we will be needed in the future. Neil Barclay of Meridian Energy gave us some clear thinking on how we can move forward, how much we do and don't know, and how we are part of the global engineering community that will solve the issues we face. Running such a big and busy conference and exhibition is no easy task. I would like to acknowledge the hard work of the organising team from the EEA office, ably supported by conferences and events. The EEA continues to be proactive in addressing your issues and concerns, and also is listening carefully to identify opportunities where we can provide services and resources to support your work and our members. This includes the annual conference. Shortly you will be receiving a delegate survey, and I would urge you to share your thoughts with us so we can improve the event for the future. It has been a fabulous event this year, enthralling conference and vibrant exhibition. We are already planning next year, so please note that we're back here in Sky City on the 25th to the 27th of June in 2019. I'll leave you with a parting thought. I've seen a common thread running throughout many of the keynotes, presentations and discussions this week. An exciting and heartwarming thought for all of us, and one I would like you all to take home with you and bring to the office on Monday. This is a great time to be an engineer. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a safe journey home.